A very good morning, and you're most welcome to this morning's Signpost webinar coming to on a rather autumnal looking Friday the 13th here in the west of Ireland. Let's hope it's a good one for us all. As you know, we like to invite speakers from across the globe to gain insights into how other countries are rising to the sustainability challenge. So today we're going to be taking a look over the hedge at what our close neighbours in Scotland are doing, particularly in the area of farmland biodiversity. And we're delighted to be joined by Professor Davy McCracken, who is head of the Department of Integrated Land Management at Scotland's Rural College. And I think, Davy, it would be fair to say that you've dedicated your career to studying farming and wildlife interactions and their impacts on policy in the area. You're very welcome to today's Signpost webinar.
Yes, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here, Mark. I'm looking forward to it.
Great. And we're also delighted to be joined by Ivan Kelly, who's an environment specialist in Teagasc, specializing in farming in extensive areas. Ivan, good morning to you.
Good morning, Mark. How are you?
Great. And you're going to help us with questions later on. And hopefully we'll have a nice discussion around this area and the challenges facing the farming community around managing that balance between producing food and whilst also producing environmental goods such as biodiversity. So, Davy, maybe you could tell us a little bit about the work that you've been doing in Scotland's Rural College.
Yes, I mean, I was born and bred in a hill sheep farm in southern Scotland. I'm an ecologist. I've been studying, as you said, farming and wildlife interactions for more than 30 plus decades. And a lot of my initial work was actually on a European basis, what we now call high nature value farming systems, the type of extensive, primarily livestock, but not exclusively livestock systems that still occur throughout Europe. I joined SRUC back in 1995 as a researcher. We had a lot of different hats within the organisation, but for the last 11 years, we have a Hill and Mountain Research Centre, an upland research farm near Crianlarich in the Southern Highlands, where we're doing agricultural and environmental research. I was fortunate enough to take over head of the research centre back in 2013. And I do a lot of policy work for the EU, for the UK government, for the Scottish government, both from an agricultural, but particularly from an environmental and a biodiversity perspective.
Brilliant. So I think you're more than qualified to be talking to us today about the environmental challenges and also the opportunities for Scotland. So I think we'll just get straight into the presentation. And I know you have some slides that you'd like to share with us. So if you'd like to do that now, and just while you're doing that, to remind everybody that today's session is being recorded and will be available on the Teagasc YouTube channel afterwards, along with Davy's presentation, also on the Teagasc website. And please do send us your questions. You have a Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. We'd love to hear any questions or indeed comments that you might have on Davy's presentation. So we can see your slides there perfectly, Davy. So I think we'll hand over and we'll chat to you after your presentation.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Mark. So any of you that have visited Scotland, and particularly the west of Scotland, will know it's quite a wet environment. The slide on the left-hand side there is giving an idea as to the sort of average rainfall patterns over the last sort of 30, 40 years. But what's been happening in recent years is Scotland has been getting much wetter, particularly during the winter, and we're seeing much more extreme events. So the east coast of Scotland last October was decimated by a severe storm that impacted greatly on lots of communities, lots of towns and villages, but also lots of farmland. So we are in a period of climate change. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this diagram. This is what's called warming stripes. Each column in this diagram is a year. This particular one's going from 1854 to 2021. It's for Scotland. And basically the darker the blue in each column, that means that particular year was colder than the long-term average for the region. But the darker the red means that that particular year was much warmer than the long-term average. And you'll hopefully see from about 1995, 1998 onwards in Scotland, we have been and still are in a period of climate change, and particularly a period of warming, leading to more extreme weather events. Also, from my perspective, I'm an ecologist interested in farming and wildlife, and particularly birds and farming interactions. We have seen large declines in our biodiversity across Scotland. The graphic on the right-hand side there is groups of birds associated with woodland in green, and groups of birds associated with farmland in orange, and groups of birds associated with uplands in blue. And the graph is showing the trend in the population sizes of those groups of birds since 1994 in Scotland. And basically, as far as our woodland birds are concerned, they're doing very, very well. There's only a small number of those bird species that there's any real concern about. But when it comes to our farmland bird species and upland bird species, although the farmland bird species trend looks relatively flat, actually when you dig into the particular species involved, you'll see that there's quite a number of species in there, particularly ground nesting birds like lapwing and oystercatcher on farmland, or black grouse and curlew on our upland areas that are in severe decline. Remember, this is only since 1994, an almost 60% decline in curlew, similar decline in lapwing. There's a horrendous loss of our biodiversity, or our bird biodiversity. The map on the left, just for point of reference, is showing the sort of land capability for agriculture of Scotland. For those of you unfamiliar with Scotland, basically 70% of Scotland, or Scotland's agricultural area, is mountainous or of mountainous character. So in my screen, it's showing purple. It might be a bit more pinky on your screen. But those big, huge blobs across Scotland are showing that we have very limited good quality agricultural land. And so a lot of our focus is on our extensively managed grazing systems in the mountains. What can be done for those to actually help them adapt to climate change, mitigate climate change, but also do more from a biodiversity perspective. This map is just showing all the sort of river systems in Scotland. The oranges and the yellows, if you can see them in and around our lowland areas, are showing where we've got pollution. And the blues and the greens in most of our upland areas are showing that our water quality is relatively good, or very good, in our upland systems. But actually, going forward, how we manage our uplands in Scotland and elsewhere across the globe, how we manage our uplands to actually manage water quantity is going to be essential going forward. So our upland land management systems will be important for production, agricultural production going forward, but increasingly important for actually managing biodiversity and managing flood risk. I'm not going to talk about what's in that bubble. That's a lot of the agricultural work that we're doing at our research farm near Crianlarich in the Highlands of Scotland. I don't have time to talk to you about that today, but we are doing a lot that's showing how you can improve upland farming systems to help address some of these climate change issues. But the purpose of this slide was particularly to show that in Scotland we have a target to be net zero by 2045. And while it's important for farmers to make changes to their agricultural systems, only by doing some or all of the things in this bigger bubble, biodiversity management, flood mitigation, peatland restoration, woodland creation, etc., will our farming systems across Scotland have any chance of helping Scotland as a society reach net zero by 2045. As far as opportunities are concerned, this is a picture on a rare dry day of part of our Upland Research Centre. SRUC has a 2,200 hectare research centre near Crianlarich in the Southern Highlands. We are typical upland system in that we have very little, only about 50 hectares of in-by reasonably good quality in-by grassland. It wouldn't be good quality for any of you on the call that are dairy farmers, but the vast majority of our grazing resource on the farm is mountainous acid grassland, Nardus stricta grassland. with a lot of other habitats thrown in. But SRUC has had this research resource since 1969, so we're long-standing. But we're looking at both agricultural and environmental issues and how to integrate different management systems into upland farming systems. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit today just about some of the biodiversity and environmental work that we're actually doing. One of the quickest wins we've done on the farm is the burns, the streams that run through the lower part of the farm. We've fenced these off on the left-hand side, both to stop the livestock getting into the watercourses and causing damage to the stream sides, causing pollution into the watercourses themselves. But actually, it's allowed the existing vegetation, which wouldn't normally have got the chance to actually come into full flower, to actually flower. So our small margins, narrow margins, fenced off at this time of the year are very floristically rich. They're full of insects. They're full of swallows and house martins feeding over them during the day, and bats feeding on insects during the night, and barn owls feeding on the sort of the water voles and other small rodents that live in them. It's one of the easiest things that any farmer could do on their farm to markedly improve biodiversity on part of it. We sit within a very heavy rainfall situation where we are at Cray and Larach. We get between 2.5 and 3.5 metres of rain per year in the lower parts of the farm, and over 4 metres of rain in the upper part of the farm. But despite that, up until 2016, we'd never had any standing water on the farm. So in 2016, under an agri-environment scheme, we created a number of small wetlands, wader scrapes, shallow pools on the farm. And last year we also created another couple elsewhere on the farm, with the aspiration to actually benefit wading birds like snipe and oyster catchers feeding in the mud on insects in the mud around the water. But within weeks of creating these back in 2016, we saw dragonflies and damselflies actually making use of that standing water on the farm. So we've had a big impact on the biodiversity there. In a part of the farm that was already wet, and we just actually made use of that without having any adverse impact on the rest of the management of the lowland part of the farm. The map on the left-hand side there is showing that over 1/5 of Scotland has peatland soils and deep peatland soils, but unfortunately over 80% of those peatlands are degraded in some way or form. So over the course of the last 10 years, we have restored about 60 hectares of peatland in the uplands of the farm using a variety of methods. On the left-hand side, the hag reprofiling, those banks there that are now covered with vegetation, they previously had been open, just dry peat showing. So we've reprofiled them to stop the greenhouse gases being released into the atmosphere. The middle diagram, we had a number of erosion channels on site, so our contractors put in a series of dams to hold back shallow water to allow moss to re-establish in those over time. And we had a number of what's called peat pans, flat areas of open peat, where we've sought to re-wet and revegetate, all with the aim of stopping greenhouse gas emissions from the degraded peatland and giving it a chance to re-wet and come back to being a functioning peatland system, which would not only store carbon, but where it's wet, also have the biodiversity value that's associated with it. In Scotland, we currently have about 19% of Scotland is covered by woodland and forest. 80% of that woodland and forest is currently in the non-commercial conifer plantations. But Scottish Government has a target to markedly increase woodland cover in Scotland going forward. One, because of the carbon storage, the carbon sequestration that can occur in woodland. Also because in the more deciduous woodlands, which is in the purple on the map, if you can see that, There's biodiversity value associated with that. But also the forestry industry in Scotland is worth over £1 billion to the Scottish economy. And this graphic came from 2015, so almost 10 years ago. I think the figure is now £1.2 billion, with an aspiration that by 2030 it will be worth £2 billion to the Scottish economy. So increasing woodland on farmland is a big target for Scottish Government. And so we've also been showing how to actually integrate more trees and woodland on the farms, the hill farm at Cree and Larach. Back in 1995, we had probably 1 or 2% of the farm, with 2,200 hectares, had any form of woodland on it at all. Fast forward to now, and it's about 12% of the farm is covered in woodland of some shape or form. And I'll just talk very briefly through some of what we've actually done over the last 20, 30 years to actually achieve that. We started very, very small. We had an agri-environment scheme back in 1997. We fenced off a small patch of gorse. Gorse flowers very early in the spring. It's a good source of pollen for insects. We fenced it off to protect the gorse. There was tree species in it, and it's allowed the tree species to actually be protected from grazing animals and to actually flourish in a small scale. We also had a small area of a few aspens on the farm, fenced that off back in 1997, and they have actually regenerated well. So again, small scale things can make a big difference from a biodiversity perspective. We've also, over the course of the last 10, 15 years, put more of a focus on integrating trees more into the lower part of the farm. We have only about 50 hectares of good quality grassland. As I said, we don't want to interfere much with that grassland because it's an important driving engine block for the farm as a whole. But we do recognise the need to actually put more trees in, not just for shelter during these extreme sort of rainfall events, not this summer, clearly, but in 4 out of the last 6 summers, we have seen almost drought-like conditions up at the farm, while there's been drought conditions elsewhere. So increasingly going forward, there's going to be a need for shade for livestock on our farms, and we've been trying to show how we could put more of that into the lower part of the farm through a combination of shelter belts, wood pastures and agroforestry. The shelter belts we've put 2 in the last 8 years. Again, through a Scottish Government Agri-Environment and Climate Scheme, 160 plus trees in small plots in various parts of the farm, just as a sort of planning going forward. The large conifer shelter belt you can see in the foreground there, and that is starting to wind blow, and we are going to have to take that down at some point. So we were wanting to actually get a little bit of shelter, additional shelter, in on that lower part of the farm, to give some opportunity once we actually take aspects of that older shelter belt down. We have a number of fields on the lower part of the farm with mature trees in them, but because those fields are grazed, there's no succession coming through because the seedlings are being nibbled. So we've, in 2 or 3 areas of the farm, we've actually planted trees in and amongst protection, both to act as a bit more of a succession, to allow other trees to grow up, so that when these older trees eventually keel over, there's still tree cover there. And again, not interfering with the use of those farms, at least those fields, from a grazing perspective. We were conscious that everything we'd done to date had been traditional, in that we were primarily separating the trees from the active part of the farm. So back in 2020, just before COVID lockdown, literally just before COVID lockdown, we established a small plot of 100 trees in one part of whatever field, just as a small sort of agroforestry demonstration, basically to show the art of the possible, where there's 100 trees of 6 different species, about 7 meters apart, so as we can actually get machinery around them if we so need to. and basically protected them, and they've been grazed constantly by sheep in those fields since they were established in 2020. And the trees are starting to grow quite well now, although this picture is only from 2021. We've managed to achieve, we've managed to achieve all of that on the lower part of the farm, integrating much more in the way of trees and small amounts of woodland, without in any way adversely impacting on the agricultural management of that part of the farm. And actually, we have done it on the basis that when those trees mature, and we can maybe speak about that more in the discussion, when those trees are mature, they are going to be there to be giving essential shelter and shade throughout the whole year, and that the livestock are going to actually need in this period of changing climate. 25 years ago, we also did some much more ambitious and large-scale planting on the upper part of the farm. This, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the green strip is a gorge leading up into one of our hill glens. We planted it with native woodland under, again, a Scottish Government woodland grant scheme 25 years ago. And you can see in 2021, the gorge, excuse me, just give me a sip of tea. Apologies for that. The gorge woodland is really established well. We have now got a woodland habitat and woodland bird communities within that, which we didn't actually have before. And we also planted about 200 hectares on the higher up of mountain woodland, montane woodland at the same time. The gorge woodland is established well as woodland, and so that's providing biodiversity benefits. That's just to give you some idea of the range of tree species that were planted in both the gorge and the mountain woodland. Primarily birches, but some willows and alders, a few other species like hazel and aspen as well, sort of thing. But in the gorge woodland, that narrow strip, in addition to the woodland benefit and the biodiversity benefit from the actual trees, the understory vegetation, the fact that it's protected from grazing from sheep and from deer, has meant we've seen a range of flowering plants being able to actually subsist within those that 40 odd hectares of gorge woodland, again with bringing the biodiversity benefits associated with from that, from the flowers point of view, as well as the insects associated with them. In that gorge, we also have quite a lot of purple moorgrass, Millennia grassland, which we didn't have before. It was Nardus grassland, acid grassland originally. And that is an important host plant for the Scotch Argus butterfly, or the caterpillars of the butterfly. So now if you go into that gorge at the right time during the summer, you see hundreds, if not thousands, of these butterflies on the wing. Again, not this year, just because of the poor weather conditions we've actually had. And in the upland part of the gorge, we've planted mountain woodland at an altitude between 350 and 550 metres. We were intending that wasn't just going to be a woodland, it was going to be what they call a silvopastoral system. We wanted to establish woodland at that altitude, but then allow the livestock, the sheep, back in and be able to actually compare and contrast with the glen next door. What are the benefits of having shelter at that sort of altitude in terms of the performance of the sheep? 25 years on, you can't tell from this picture, but most of the trees that have established are still no more than sort of 5 feet tall, and no thicker than my thumb, sort of thing. So it's taking a long time. The trees are there, they've established, but it's going to be a few more years before we can actually let livestock back in to that area safely. And by safely, I mean without damaging the actual trees itself. But again, protecting the wider area from grazing at the moment, from sheep and deer, has meant that the understory vegetation has come away that wasn't there before. Well, it was there, but just hanging on by the skin of its teeth. So with a wide range of plant species, upland plant species, as well as northern egger moth is a moth that's more Catholic in its taste. It eats a lot of, its caterpillar eats a lot of different things. So again, we've produced an additional biodiversity benefit on a larger part of the farm. So we've actually done a lot for biodiversity on the farm. So you may think, well, that's great. That's all you need to do. Well, actually, I'm sure it's probably the same in Ireland. There's a lot of discussion and debate about should we be supporting extensive farming systems in Scotland, and what are they producing benefit to wider society. So it's actually important that you actually not just do these management systems, but actually monitor and provide the evidence that the changes we were expecting are actually happening. That's very difficult in a 2,200 hectare topographically challenging environment. And so a lot of what we've been doing over the last 6 years, I think it is, we've been using what's called Internet of Things technology. Basically, we've established a radio network over the farms where we're linking in sensors that are either in the environment or in some of the other research on livestock to get information that we couldn't gather easily or at all about what's happening on parts of the farm. That's just one diagram of a picture of the lower part of the farm showing that we've got different types of sensors measuring soil temperatures and moistures in the lowlands and in the uplands. We've got weather stations now in the automatic weather stations in the upland area as well, giving us information every 10 minutes automatically being sent from these sensors over the network back to our base. A lot of the environmental issues that we're interested in Scotland and elsewhere in the uplands are all to do with carbon, whether it's carbon stored in the soil and carbon stored in the ground vegetation. So these two diagrams are just maps of just the upper part of the farm, the two big highland glens that we actually have. Unfortunately, as yet, we don't have any quick technological fix to actually get good information on carbon storage in that part of the farm. So these diagrams for the soil and the vegetation have been collected old school by going out and taking physical samples and running them through a laboratory analysis in order to get a feel for where carbon has been stored in both of these glens and how different it actually may be. Excuse me. When you actually plant woodland or not. So the woodland's on the right hand side of each map. The Grays Glen is on the left hand side of each map. We're also particularly interested in flooding and flood mitigation, as I've said, and we can do calculations very, very easily in terms of knowing what vegetation is there and estimating that the glen on the right-hand side should be helping to actually mitigate flooding. What we're doing, we're using that radio network, we're using sensors, in this case, sensors that are measuring the height of the water to start to get some indication as to, after extreme rainfall events, does the water coming out of the wooded glen, does it rise quicker or slower than the water coming out of the Grays Glen? All to try and understand how the land management changes we've introduced have actually impacted or have they had any real impact. We've also been looking at biodiversity surveys, and I'm fortunate I have a John and a Millie, two members of staff who are excellent ecologists, but it's expensive, time-consuming, and difficult to cover a farm the size of ours with only a small number of staff at the key times of year. So in recent years, we've been looking at using technology to get some handle on biodiversity on the farms as well. I just want to talk about the green box in the middle of the picture there is a thing called audio moth. It's an acoustic sensor. We can use it to assess bird occurrence or bat occurrence by changing the frequency. Basically, it listens out for what it regards as bird sounds, and then we bring the sensor back to the laboratory, plug the SD card into a computer and use a software package to identify what the bird species might be. It works exactly the same. It uses the same data package as database as an app called Merlin that some of you may have on your mobile phone. The advantage of the audio moth is you can change the confidence limits of the of the sensor. Sorry, you can change the sensitivity of the sensor in terms of what it tries to, what noise it hears, and how it tries to actually interpret that. And so we are looking at how we can make sure that using those type of technologies is actually robust. On the left-hand side, if you just go out, put the sensors out, it will give you a long list of the birds that it hears. This is over a 10-night, 2 5-night periods. The problem with any artificial intelligence, because it is artificial intelligence, is it will seek to identify any sound that occurs within the frequency that you have set it for. So we know that although it's saying we have, what's that, I can't remember how many species is on that list, but we know those that have just starred won't have been there, will never have been there. There's lots of false positives coming out. We can change the confidence limits in terms of when we're running the software through the identification package or using the software, so we can reduce the overall species list to something that's much more robust. But even so, the odd strangulated cry of a lamb or a car backfiring or a train chugging in the distance can produce a sound in that frequency that the sensor automatically tries to identify. So we're currently going through trying to actually work out and provide some guidance to farmers and land managers how we can use these things robustly. At least in the UK, I see a lot of pictures on social media, farmers saying, I've just been out with the app on my phone and here's the list of bird species I have. Some of those bird species, in many cases, won't actually have been in that farm. And we want to make sure that when farmers are making claims about what's on their farm, that they are robust. Otherwise, those doubting Thomases that don't like farmers and don't think farmers are important, it provides them with ammunition to continue to make the case that we should be rewilding rather than having farming continuing. I'm just coming to the end. I've talked about the environmental side of things from a biodiversity perspective. Obviously, livestock in the uplands or livestock anywhere is extremely to the forefront of policies. I'm not going to talk about it today. I'm sure one of my colleagues would be more than happy to come back and talk to you about it in the future. And we're doing a lot of work looking at the livestock on the farms. On the left-hand side, we're looking at feed efficiency, how well our lambs are actually finishing before going off to slaughter. How much are they eating? Who's doing things more efficiently? We're using CT scanners to actually measure the size of the rumen volume, because there's a relationship between methane emission and rumen volume. And in the last 18 months, we've also had what's called portable accumulation chambers, where we can actually measure the actual methane emissions from individual animals, and looking to use that information to help potentially select which animals we maintain in the breeding flock going forward, if they perform well, but also are producing less methane and be more feed efficient. Those are the animals we would want up in our hills and uplands. And also the radio network that we actually have. We're using that for a wide variety of projects, some in association with colleagues in Teagasc, where we're looking at how can you use that radio network and sensors on the animal or around the animal to get a better indication of the health and the performance of those animals in different parts of the farm. And again, I would be more than happy to suggest some of my colleagues on the team who, if you're interested, who you may want to have at a seminar at a later date, going into a bit more detail about some of those projects. I'll just finish there. The slides will be made available. I'm quite sure there's links there to additional podcasts and small videos about what we do. And I just have to end. I'm contractually obliged by having to say who is the wide range of funders that fund our research at the farm. So I hope that was of some interest to yourselves, and is coming in at roughly the half-hour period.
Brilliant. No, so you're spot on time, Davy, and leaves us lots of time to just have a nice discussion around what you presented there. And look, it is just from a Teagasc perspective, we're delighted to have that connection and relationship with yourselves in SRUC, and we've had a number of shared events and over the years. So we're delighted to have that connection, given the just the similar challenges that we face, and it makes sense to work together on these things. Um, you also described some serious figures there around rainfall, which I didn't really like. We've maybe on some of our more extreme areas in Ireland, we'd maybe have up to 2 meters on the outside of it, but 2.5 to 3.5. That's a very, very different type of a rainfall. I mean, those figures, are they that the pattern in which that rain is falling as well is changing from our earlier discussions?
Yeah, well, it's the pattern to some extent, but it's more so. Normally we would expect May, June to be our sort of drier months anyway. So that pattern is largely still maintaining, but it's actually when it does rain, we're getting much shorter, sharper, much more extreme events sort of thing. So, um, as I said, in August, we would normally get at the farm for August about 137 millimeters of rain. We have a meteorological station in the lower part of the farm. I think John, my colleague, said when I returned from leave at the end of August, we did 257 in just that 1 month. So and almost double what we would normally expect. So it's the short sharpness of it, and those extreme events are not just happening during the winter. Our offices of the farm in summer, June, I think it was 2012, there was just a very concentrated summer storm right above us. So our offices were flooded. We had 4 bridges on the farm swept away. We had just reseeded one of our grassland fields. All the topsoil was swept into the river, and that field has been poorly performing ever since. And I can't remember how many meters of fencing we had swept away, sort of thing. So it's happening. Historically, we would be worried about storms during the winter. We're now getting extreme events at all points during the year.
Very good. Just before we get to the questions there, I'm intrigued. You'd presented a slide there on agroforestry and some experiments you're doing around that. I mean, and also there's, like in Ireland, a huge ambition there around the level of afforestation or woodlands that are being planted. What is the general view by farmers of these measures or this ambition? Do they share in that ambition?
Well, interesting you should say, Mark. Certainly, upland farmers. Historically, we had situations in Scotland where initially whole hill farms, and then latterly in the 60s and 70s, parts of a hill farm were taken over for forestry or bought for forestry. And so many hill farmers and foresters don't see eye to eye at all. But so that's why a lot of what we've been doing in the last 10 years has been trying to show actually there's a way you can actually integrate trees onto farms and still have a functioning hill farm, and actually still make that hill farm much more resilient. And there's a lot of initiatives in Scotland looking. There's a thing called the Integrating Trees Network that I was speaking at earlier this week up in the Highlands. Not at our farm, at another farm, just highlighting to farmers why they should be considering trees on farms. I'm not saying there is not a gang rushing over the hill desperate, but the interest is actually growing and it's becoming substantial now. Our recognition, particularly when we've seen these really adverse events in recent years, are an increasing recognition that, well, actually, if I had planted trees 20 years ago, maybe it wouldn't have been as bad on the farm. And so people are showing much more of an interest. So, but it would be wrong to say everybody is all for trees. There's still a reluctance on some part.
Thanks. Huge amount of compliments coming in here, Davy, about your presentation. So I'm sure.
All right, that's good to hear. I'm a man, so I can't multitask. So I'm making sure I can see you and listen to you, and I'm not looking at the Q&A at the moment.
So. No, and we don't expect you to. We'll take care of that side of things. Ivan, there's lots of interesting questions coming through there.
Yeah, correct, Mark. There's a lot of very positive comments, David, to the presentation. Just to follow up on that last point in regard to trees. Obviously, there's many benefits, but there's also obviously risks, especially planting trees maybe in peat areas on slopes, risk to loss of carbon initially, risk to water quality and so on. How do you balance that, or do you do impact assessments and that on the farm and messages around that for farmers?
Would impact assessments per se, we're not doing any of those on the farm. In Scotland, we have legislation that says you're unable to plant trees on deep peat more than 50 centimetres deep. We haven't any of that down the lowland part of the farm, so we've been able to plant trees where we felt it was more relevant to plant. The plantings we did on the upper part of the farm, the upland part of the farm, where it's primarily shallow peat that we have there. When we did the plantings 25 years ago, we were consciously avoiding the areas where there were deeper peat area sort of thing. And interestingly, in that 200 hectares, the bowl of the glen that we had planted 25 years ago, there was about 50 hectares of degraded peat, these peat hags, the vertical faces with no vegetation on it, simply protecting that whole area from grazing by sheep and deer as much as we could. Those degraded peatlands have revegetated naturally. We haven't gone in to do anything. So, but we haven't been looking at the impact per se of that. What we are interested in doing is there's one area on the farm, it's too far away. There's no easy access to it. It's degraded peat. We won't be able to get there with the machinery without causing more damage than we would seek to fix. So where we have restored peatland, we're keen to put soil moisture sensors, and you can get we have soil moisture sensors that give measurements every 10 centimetres. We're keen to put sensors into both of those situations to show and see how the water table rises and falls quicker in the degraded peat, and where we've restored it, we've at least made some benefit to that sort of thing. But that's as far as the impact assessments that we're actually doing currently.
No, that's fine. Yeah, maybe two questions. I might kind of combine them a little bit. One question is on: is there a significant deer population present in the area, and what controls are there? Maybe very much tied with that, then other legal predator control methods such as foxes, hooded crows, magpies, and so on.
Yep. So the two neighbouring estates outside of us, and both of them are bigger estates. Historically, they were deer, not deer farms. They were for deer stalking. So there's a large deer presence in the estates around us. There's a large amount of red deer across the uplands of Scotland as a whole, which is seen as an environmental issue. We have a small population of deer on the farm. There's a large area. It's not part of the farm, a conifer plantation that used to be part of the farm, but was planted before we took over it in the 1960s. There's a small, probably about 30 or 35 hind population of red deer in there. They largely stay in the woodland or come out onto our moorland. We're not bothered about the deer being on the moorland itself. We're only bothered about deer if they get into our deciduous woodlands or down onto our good quality in-by grasslands. So we employ a contractor who comes in and controls the deer. He's taking on average between 40 and 50 deer a year, primarily young stags who are coming from neighbouring areas, wandering around looking for other sort of territories. We're solely practicing a pest control policy with regard to the deer, and we have some designated sites higher up in the mountains, and neighbouring estates have as well. We're part of a deer management group within Scotland. With regard to foxes, etc., crows, we do have a fox control policy, particularly for in the build up to lambing time, and the woodland that we've established in the uplands. We've now got black grouse back in small numbers on the farm, and as part of an agri-environment scheme we're in, we have a crow control policy as well in and around the black grouse breeding season. That is it proving successful? We're certainly seeing more, but it's still small numbers of males at the leks. How well they're actually breeding, we don't know, but we know we are controlling the crows, which is having a benefit both to the potential benefit both to the black grouse, but certainly having a benefit to the lambing or the lambs during the early part of the lambing season.
We'll say, talking about trees and not just to Cranleoric, but to the, we'll say, there's a mention here in one of the questions about planting of conifer plantations in Scotland and so on, and the long-term impacts on ground nesting birds, I suppose, especially where we'll say where gamekeepers are not in play or not in the area.
Yes, so the figures I showed earlier, lapwing curlew declining by almost 60% over Scotland as a whole. That has been a combination of habitat change, both in terms of open habitats that they use being less managed, as well as planting of some of the habitats that they would have used, as well as the increase in predators and predator pressure, coming from the likes of foxes who have always been controlled across Scotland, but maybe less so in some areas. A marked increase in our badger population who will take ground nesting birds, and particularly protection of birds like raven over the last 30 years. I mean, they've spread all over Scotland now, so we've got avian predators as well. So yes, there is a very complicated relationship between land management practice, predators, and existence of predators. All we're doing on the farm is practicing legal predator control where we actually can. We did used to have lapwing on the farm in small numbers. We did used to have curlew on the farm in small numbers. They've disappeared from the farm, not necessarily from anything that we have done per se, but just because they operate at a landscape scale. And I probably should have shown a picture of looking out from the farm. We have a large number of conifer plantations on the opposite side of the glen from where we sit, and certainly that will have had an impact going forward. So there's a lot of discussion in Scotland at the moment about how we balance the aspiration for getting more woodland, maintaining wading bird populations like lapwing and curlew. It's not an easy fix. There's no easy answer. It's not just one thing. Let's get the predator control right. We also have to get the habitat management right as well.
Yeah, Davy, we have some questions coming in around the carbon and biodiversity credit side of things. What sort are there any market incentives being discussed there for farmers around this area? I know there's a lot of discussion around carbon trading and so forth, but is there any?
So there is a number of carbon codes currently being developed in Scotland and the wider UK. There's been a woodland carbon code in existence for a number of years now. There's a peatland carbon code has been developed in more recent years to help sort of underpin these developing carbon markets. In England, I think it's now mandatory for biodiversity net gain that any business that makes marked changes, has to then seek to offset that elsewhere. We don't have biodiversity net gain as a legal requirement in Scotland as yet. The Scottish Government are still looking at it. So other than agri-environment and peatland action, from a biodiversity perspective, there's no legal requirement as yet, although Scottish Government are, through what's called a natural environment bill going through the Parliament in this parliamentary session, will give themselves and any subsequent government legally binding targets with regard to nature restoration and biodiversity recovery. As far as carbon trading is concerned, there's a lot of it happening at the minute. We are very cautious about it. Certainly in Scotland, the Scottish Government are keeping the basic payment, the agricultural support payment, but putting more environmental conditions on that, asking farmers to voluntarily do more going forward from 2025 in order to continue to receive the basic payment. Some of that will revolve around, is bound to revolve around carbon. So we're asking farmers to be cautious. Don't give away the carbon on your farm to an outside body because you might need it yourself, to actually to continue to qualify for agricultural support payments. And also, if I'm honest, it's a very it's a very early development time for the sort of the carbon markets in Scotland and no doubt elsewhere. It's not quite the Wild West, but it's not far off it. Some individuals promising the earth. So we're also asking farmers to be very, or suggesting to farmers to be very, very wary what type of contract they get into, particularly over the length of it and the conditions that they will then have to continue to actually apply in order to continue to actually qualify for the payments going forward. Whether it's a 10, 15, 25, 50 year period, it's still to settle down.
Okay, thank you.
So a few questions there around grazing strategies. I suppose everything looking at different farm systems, and I suppose the balance between, you know, all around mixed grazing, cattle and sheep, but even within sheep and the different breeds for production of meat, I suppose, versus the production of all the other ecosystem services. And have you looked at that in much detail, or what work is going on in that area?
Yep. So historically, traditionally, we've been working with Scottish blackface, and we've been improving through genetic and looking at the performance of them and selecting the best performing sheep and lambs. We've markedly improved the performance of our Scottish blackface in the flock. We, for 15 years, were also running Welsh Cleans, LLEYNs, alongside them. So they're a hill breed rather than an upland breed. And they were proving to be very productive, even in our situation where they weren't expected to. But unfortunately, the beast from the east year in 2015 or 2016, the storm we got in early spring, severe snowstorms, the whole of the UK. I'm not sure how much it reached over into Ireland. Got the clins on the farm melted literally in that situation. So for the last couple of years, we've been actually crossing black faces with clins and clins with black faces, looking to see if we can ultimately develop the best of both worlds, the more productive and maternal instinct from the clin, but with the hardiness of the Scottish blackface. So that's still a work in progress there. We also have a small herd of Aberdeen Angus or Aberdeen Angus stroke Shorthorn cross cows on the farm, who are primarily out on the hill from late April, early May, depending on the year, through into December each year, with a view that they're out there to be doing that mixed grazing to actually try and improve the vegetation. The good thing about sheep is they subsist very well out in our moorland situation. The downside about those sheep is they're very selective grazers. So our moorland is Nardis grassland, Nardis stricta grassland dominated, acid grassland dominated, because the sheep don't eat it. They're going for the finer herbs and grasses that go around it. And so over time, we are anticipating that the cattle grazing alongside the sheep, because they browse differently, will open up and take more of that acid grassland out and allow much more of the better grasses to sort of flourish. So we are looking at that, and the difficulty I was expecting maybe the question is about rotational grazing or mob grazing. We have a small amount of in-buy. We don't really have the facility to rotationally graze it, because all of it's needed throughout most of the year, and our compartments on the hill are so big, and most of the hill ground is open to our neighbours, that we've limited opportunity to rotationally graze the sheep there. We are looking into not rotational grazing, but targeting the grazing of the cattle more. We've got these geofence collars. We are using a type by a company called No Fence. We're really interested in using them to target our cattle grazing on the hill more effectively, and also to try and keep them away from some parts of the hill as well, dangerous areas of the hill, or even just the woodlands. Cattle and stock fences don't mix very well, as we've found to our detriment in recent years.
Yeah, they do offer a huge potential, those virtual fences, and also protecting landscape and visiting our migratory birds. I know don't get on well with these fences either. So Practical question, Davy, just in relation to the agroforestry side of things, as to how many years do you think you'll need to keep the upland agroforestry area fenced before bringing livestock back in? I guess this depends on the species to some degree.
Yeah.
But
so initially, I wasn't involved with the initial work 25 years ago. But initially, our colleagues were expecting within 10 years of the planting, they would have been able to put the sheep back in, and that clearly wasn't the situation. In currently that 200 hectares, the fence around it has started to deteriorate, especially this year. The cattle burst into that woodland. And while myself and one of the team had been thinking we might need another 10 years or whatever before we were actually putting the livestock back in, for two reasons. One, the fence is deteriorated and we can't afford to refence it. And two, the cattle are already in there and they want to be in there and they seem to be benefiting from being in there. So over the course of the next few months, we're going to be having serious conversations within the team to say, well, what do we need to do to allow the animals back in at certain times of the year, and to protect the trees as much as possible, but to actually, basically, I'm saying that re-establishment of grazing in that area has happened, fortuitously or unfortuitously, and we're now in a position where we'll still continue to protect the trees from deer, because at the right time of year, the cattle aren't going to do that much damage to those trees, even though they're relatively low. Sheep might do more damage, and deer would certainly do more damage at certain times. So we can't afford to let up on the deer control.
Sure.
David, just in relation to a huge amount of metrics and data is collected, and you've shown how, we'll say, if some of it is used to manage biodiversity and stuff better on the farm. But is this information and metrics being passed on to feed into policy? And how in the future, we'll say, are farmers going to learn from this, and maybe what are the key simple steps the farmers can take today on their farm? So I know, for example, you mentioned a margin there along your water course. What are the key things that you found to date? So I suppose it's a two-part question. How will the metrics feed into policy, and then what are the key things the farmers can take on that are doable today?
Yeah. So as part of the developing agricultural support policy, there's a recognition that by Scottish Government and their agencies that we need to show that policy is having a benefit. And so there's going to be more of an ask of Scottish farmers to collect biodiversity information. So Nature Scot, our Nature Conservation Agency, is developing a mapping app, a habitat mapping app, that you can then not only map the habitats on your farm, but you can then take a geo-reference picture that shows the condition of those habitats as one way of starting to build up a database for a farm, and then for Scotland as a whole, as to how things are changing and potentially changing for the better. And the other reason that we're looking at these bioacoustic monitors, for example, and separately there's camera traps that I showed but didn't have time to talk about. We're looking at easy ways that farmers could be able to collect information on their farms that's going to be robust and repeatable, and believed by agencies, is recognised by Scottish Government, by farmers, and by consultants out there. There's not going to be enough consultants, there's not going to be enough funding to fund huge numbers of traditional ecologists going out and sampling all these areas of Scotland. We need to find alternative ways to collect some information that then gives at least an indication that there's a direction of travel, that the biodiversity is changing in the way it is. I think there was a second part to your question, Ivan. Apologies, I've forgotten what that was.
Yeah, no, yeah. So I suppose what are if you were to pick 2 or 3 simple measures you put on your farm that could be rolled out on farms today at relatively simple cost? Yeah.
The measures, as I think I said in the presentation, fencing off those water courses in the lowland part of the farm, bit of capital funding to allow you to actually do that. That's it. We have done nothing else with those areas. The vegetation has just flourished. I think it's maybe even that is what's behind me on the screen. The vegetation has just flourished naturally. That is the quickest, easiest biodiversity win that anybody, upland or lowland farmer, could actually do. And then everybody will, the second thing I would say is everybody will have an area of their farm where they could consider putting in trees at, I don't mean vast extent of trees or even very dense trees, but putting in a small number of trees in different parts of the farm will over time, in 10 years' time, 10, 15 years' time, once those trees are established, start to make a major difference to that part of the farm in terms of the shelter and shade for livestock, if it's along water courses for the fish and the invertebrates in the watercourse, and for wider biodiversity. Those would be the two easiest things I would say to jump out into. Other things are possible, but that will actually depend much more on the individual farm and what opportunities are there.
Davy, thank you so much for a really fascinating hour, and I think all the comments in the Q&A reflect that. And for ending on that practical note, it's hard to believe we're out of time already. But thank you so much for joining us today, and you're sharing those learnings and the continued work that you're doing there in SRUC. And look, we'd hope to keep in touch with you and your colleagues on that, and perhaps we'll have you back again, or some of your colleagues, to talk about that really excellent work that's happening there.